All right, thank you for coming to my talk, the last minute edition of Composer 101. A little bit about myself when we get started. My name is Mike Miles. I'm from the Boston area. I've been a developer for a long time. I should click on my slides so they go through. So I work at a digital marketing agency called Genuine. I'm the VP of technology there. But most of my time is still doing technical architecture for PHP-based projects. Genuine, based in Boston, but we have offices Chicago, New York, San Francisco. We do a whole lot of work beyond development, beyond PHP development. So you can check us out at wearegenuine.com. At night, I host a podcast called Developing Up, which is focused on the non-technical side of being a developer. So anything related to a career in development that's not code related is what we talk about. I actually just today recorded the first episode of season 3 in that room right there, so that's fun. So you can check that out at developinghub.com. If you want to know any more about me, you can find me all over the internet at MikeMiles86 on Twitter, on LinkedIn. I'm very active in the Drupal community, so you can find me on the Drupal website. If you see anything online with this handle and something you don't agree with, then it wasn't me who wrote it, so that's somebody else who has that handle. So I think there's a good segue from if you're at the keynote that just ended, which was amazing, talking about design and about building intent and about wanting to leverage and copy people by, what did he say? He used 2 I words. Innovation and imitation, right. So there's a time to imitate because people do things well, and a time to innovate when you get real value. And I think anyone in this room, who here would consider themselves a developer? Nobody. How many people work with developers? All right. How many people know what a developer is? Okay, all right. So I think everyone in this room, you probably work on some sort of project or for a company that builds something or builds something for other clients, and everybody has the same thing in common with their projects, is that they all have a limited time and budget. So when you have developers, when you have people, you have to balance how much time you innovate, because it's risky, and how much you can imitate so that you can use it. And so with developers, the more time you spend managing code, and especially like using third-party libraries that do a lot for you, people have built them well, and you don't want to spend the time to reinvent that wheel, but then you have to manage that. The more time you spend on that, the less time you have to build the innovative code that delivers value to your clients or to your product, that really separates them. And that on PHP projects can become a big hassle because there's a lot of frameworks out there, a lot of tools and libraries you can use that suck up that time and budget on a project. So if you can use something like Composer, it can save you that time and budget so you can spend it on your code that delivers value, that lets you innovate. So Composer is a PHP project dependency manager. What it does is it manages any third-party libraries and projects and code that you want to use on your PHP-based project so that you don't manually have to spend the time to do it, or your team doesn't have to do that. So what I want to talk about today is the basics of Composer. First, I want to explain the benefits of using Composer, or throughout this talk, hopefully explain the benefits of using Composer. I want to outline how a Composer project is structured and how it's set up, and also demonstrate to you the 5 Composer commands you need to know to be able to use Composer successfully. There's only really 5 commands. If you master them, you can pretty much use Composer for managing a whole lot of your project and saving a lot of your sanity and allowing you to spend your time to innovate your product. So I'm going to talk about the 5 Composer commands you need to know. So a Composer project is typically structured as follows. It has these, what I call 3.5 items. So there's a composer.var. This is a PHP executable. That's the actual Composer file. The Composer itself is built in PHP. That may or may not be in the project structure. I'll get to that in a little bit, why that's the case. There's a composer.json file that has all the project metadata and information about what packages your project requires that you as a person, as a team, maintain. There's a composer.log file. This is a file generated by Composer. It's how Composer monitors and keeps track of the packages that you need on your code of the third-party libraries you're using and what versions of it you're using. And then there's the vendor directory. That's where Composer keeps all that third-party library code by default. So tucked into there. And then there's everything else that would be in your project, all the code that you're writing, that your team's writing, to build a product or a project of some sort. So this is the typical Composer structure, the very basic one. You may see something a little more secure in this version, which is just everything else gets moved into a web root. Whether you call this doc root or www, whatever you want to call it, you put everything in there, so that way if your domain or your app, whatever user interface points to your code, it's pointing within the web root. That means no one can access anything outside of the web root, or they shouldn't be able to. This is a more secure for reasons of that if you're using Composer to manage libraries for you, you don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of those packages, all the files that are there. If some attacker is smart enough and you're not using everything else in a web root, they could get into that vendor directory and trigger some sort of security risk or security security hole in that vendor code and then use it maliciously against you. But if that's above your web root, it's harder for them to get to that. So a more secure version is to have everything in the web root and then the Composer sitting on top of that. So if you want to use Composer for managing a PHP project, the first thing you have to do is install it on your system. And this is, again, the composer.phar file, the PHP executable that you run to execute Composer commands. Composer can be installed on almost any system. So on Windows, the Composer website has a great executable file you can download at getcomposer.org/composer-setup.exe. You download that, it'll help you set up Composer on your Windows machine if that's what you're using. It'll check your system, check your permissions, help you get all set up, and put Composer in a place that you can use it. If you're using any other sort of system, Linux, Unix, or OS X, it's recommended you follow the download instructions at getcomposer.org/download. The download instructions, I'll show you them, I'll demo them. It's just 4 PHP commands to run in your terminal that will get you Composer on your machine. Now there's 2 different ways to install Composer, either globally or per project. It depends on the preferences of your team. Both have benefits and drawbacks. So if you install Composer globally, you're putting it on your machine once, and then you can use it anywhere in your machine on any project. Obviously that's a benefit because you just have to install it once. It doesn't matter, it's good to go. But if you have it globally and you install it on your system, that means everybody's responsible for installing it on their system, which could get you to the place where if someone joins your team, a developer joins your team a year after you started a project, and they install Composer on the machine, they might have a different version, right? And we always want to try to avoid that differences in systems if we can, just to cut out those problems of it works on my machine. Per project is where you keep the .phar file in your code base, so probably in a Git repository that your code is being hosted on. So anytime someone pulls down that code base, they have Composer available to them in that project. Caveat to that is that it actually takes a couple more characters in the command line to execute a Composer command. It's 6 extra characters, so it's not that big of a deal, but it can be a little bit annoying to type PHP space composer.phar instead of just typing Composer, what you can do with global. So it depends on what your team wants to do and their preference. I've worked with it both ways, install globally on a system and install per project, and they both work very well. So how you install Composer, hopefully the Wi-Fi keeps going very well for me. If not, I'll switch to my other version of this presentation. Like I said, I'm on a Mac. Oh no, I have to log in. All right, let's see if I can do this real quick. Where's my mouse?
Do you need us to read you the number?
All right, what's the number?
489-02532. And the password is 308-54157.
Thank you very much. All right, let's see if that worked. All right, great. Thank you very much for that. All right, so this is the download page on getcomposer.org. 4 PHP commands that I'm going to basically copy and paste into my terminal. So this first one here, this is going to download the setup command, the setup file. So I run that execute command, and in this directory I'm in, you'll see it's composer-setup.php. So it downloaded it. The next command here, it hashes that file and it checks it against the hash to make sure there wasn't any man-in-the-middle attack, that you didn't get any corrupted files, that you got the version you were expected. So if you run this, which when I paste it in, it just runs it. If it's a valid install file, it'll say installer verified. If not, it'll delete the file and tell you it's a corrupt file. You should check out how you're trying to get that setup file. So at this point, again, I just have the setup.php file in my directory. Third command, I'm just going to copy this, and this is going to execute that setup PHP file. And what this does is checks your system for a couple of minimum things that Composer needs to run. So it checks what version of PHP you have installed in your system. Composer needs 5.3 at the very least, which is a very old version of PHP. If there are any problems, your system doesn't have the requirements, it would tell you here in big red text what you need to do to fix it. Otherwise, if it works, it'll download the executable file, composer.php, and it'll tell you, great, you're good to go. So now we can see in this directory, I have the setup file and I have the executable file. The last step is just a cleanup step, is to get rid of that setup file. You only need it to verify your system and download the FAR file. Composer recommends you get rid of this and you use these commands every time you want to set up Composer for a project. Again, to check to make sure you have a valid version and you get the most updated version of that setup. So when I got rid of that, my directory just has the .phar file. So right now, this is installed on my project directory. So at this point, I could check this into my Git repo, push it up. Anyone who pulls down this repo then has this version of Composer. And the way you run Composer here is I do php composer.phar. You see I got all these Composer commands here. There's a lot of commands to learn. Again, I'm just going to teach you about the 5 you really need to know. So you see I have Composer. So that's installing for a project, good to go. But if you want to install it globally, there's one extra piece you have to do. You still follow those steps to install it, but then you just move that executable file into a system-wide location. So for Mac, that would be like user local bin, and that's where I'm going to move this one now. So I have composer.phar. I'm going to move it to user local bin. I'm going to call it Composer, not Cinnamon. All right, so now my project directory doesn't have anything in it. It's empty. But I can now just type Composer, and I have Composer available to me. I can use it. Clear. What I can even do is I can cd out of this directory. I'm in a whole different directory now, and I can still type Composer. Right? I still have Composer available. So it's available system-wide, so I can use it, install it once, and use it on all my projects if I wanted to. Just move back into that directory. Great. So Composer's installed. You're ready to use it on your projects. What do you need to do next is initialize and build your composer.json file. Again, this is just a schema file that has all your project metadata in it. You could write this by yourself, and I'm going to show you the basic structure in a moment, but Composer has a command that will generate this file for you. It's called the init command. So you type composer init or php composer.phar init, and it's going to take you through interactive prompt for generating the file. The file is structured like this. It has a lot of metadata. That means a bunch of information to your team, and only some information that Composer really cares about. So you can have a project name, a description. For this instance, the type would be project. You can use Composer to generate Composer packages, so you can have another type. You can provide license information if your project has license requirements, like you need the GNU public license or the MIT license. You can just put that there so people know. Author information about who works on it. I'll get in about minimum stability in a little bit. And then the require array, which will contain information about what packages your project requires. It depends on them. So let's see generating the composer.json file by running the init command. So I'm going to type composer init. And again, this is helpful prompts for setting up that JSON file for Composer to use. So first ask for the package name. I recommend, as someone who works on client-facing work, I always do a client name, project name. So this would be, Nerd Summit / Composer 101. Description, my demo for the Composer 101 talk. Author information, it'll pull your logged in user information. If you want to use that, hit N to skip it. So I'll just skip it. Minimum stability. So I would recommend just skipping this question. What this means is, by default, when you start using Composer to install third-party libraries, it's only going to look for stuff that has stable releases. You can override that by saying you accept beta or alpha releases, but I generally wouldn't recommend that. There's a way to make special circumstances for individual packages. I'd recommend you do that. So I recommend you leave this blank, which will tell Composer only download stable code. Package type for this case is just project. Again, you could use Composer for generating Composer libraries that then people can download and use in their projects. So I'll just leave it as project. License information again, if you want to use that, which is metadata. And then it's going to ask you to define any dependencies out of the gate that you know of. I'm going to skip this for now because I'm going to show it as a separate step. It'll also ask you if there's any requirements you have for dev-specific packages. So Composer allows you to set up a different array of third-party libraries that you only want installed on development machines. And you install those by passing a special flag when you get to the install command, which I'll show. So you can have packages that you say only developers will download these packages and use them. So that's tools for analyzing code or for running tests and stuff like that. So I'm going to skip no for that for now. Then Composer's going to be like, hey, this is the JSON file I want to generate. Does it look right to you? Say yes, that looks good. You hit enter. And then what happens is now if I look in my directory, I have my composer.json. And I can open this up. All right, and it's exactly what it said it was going to generate. So quick and easy to do. Great, so Composer, the JSON file is initialized. Next thing you need to do is where does Composer know to look for files and look for libraries? This is where repositories come into place. If you don't define any custom repositories, Composer is going to assume you want to use packagist.org. Packagist is the default. It is the official Composer package library website. You can go here and search for any package you want. Any package that's available on Composer is available on Packagist. Some of the other PHP-based frameworks, such as Drupal and WordPress, have their own packages, which you can also go and search depending on their interface. But by default, Composer is going to use just packagist.org. But if you want to use other ones, in your composer.json file, you can add a repositories array. And for anything that uses Packagist, Packagist is open source, so you can download and set up your own. You can also you can pay them to set one up for you. You can add to the array of type composer and then the URL to it. So for example, Drupal, for all its modules and themes, has packages.drupal.org /8 for Drupal 8. WordPress has wpackagist.org that you can add that there. And you can start then pulling code from their library. So a Drupal module, WordPress plugin, things like that. Things like Symfony and Laravel, they already have all their, I think they just use Packagist by default because most of their code's available there. But you can also use any version control system as a repository. So if you have, as an organization, libraries that you build that you continually use on projects, you can keep them on GitHub or on GitLab or on Bitbucket, wherever you want to keep them in version control. And you can add that as a repository to your Composer JSON file, and then you can start pulling in those libraries yourself and use them internally, which on the Get Composer website has advanced information on how to set up, like if it's behind a private repository, how to set up API keys and stuff like that. You can do that as well. But you just add a type VCS, and then basically any repo you want, you can put in there. So you can also use this for downloading JavaScript libraries or CSS packages or SaaS projects and stuff like that. So once you have that set up, either you add your own repositories, or you don't, you use Packagist. Now you're ready to start telling Composer, I want to use these libraries in my project. And you do this by using the require command. Composer require is going to do a couple things. It's going to update the Composer JSON file. It's going to update the Composer lock file, and it's going to download code and put it in the vendor directory. Composer require can be run one of three ways. If you just say Composer require, this is going to take you through a bunch of prompts to help you find a package you want to use. You can say Composer require with a specific vendor package name. That's going to download the latest version of that package if it can find it. Or you can say, I require this package, this specific version, and it's going to go, if you can find that version, it's going to get it for you. Or you can give it a range of versions, and it'll find it within that range. So I'm going to demo all three of these just to show you the differences. So like any good developer, it's always good to have some sort of ability to log events that happen in your project. So I'm going to search for a logging library. So I'm going to type composer require. And it's going to ask me to search for a project. So I can give it a keyword that is then going to search on packages.org by default for any projects that include that keyword. So I'm going to say log. And so it makes a call to packages, comes back with a list of 15 packages that I may want to use. If I don't see anyone who's there, I can go to packages myself, find the actual package name, and paste it in here if I wanted to. I'm going to use monolog number 1. It's a very active and well-known PHP logging library. So I'll hit 1. Then I'll ask you, is there any specific version you want to use? Or do you just want to use the latest one? For this instance, let's say I want to use version 1.20.0. most packages libraries, composer libraries use semantic versioning of major.minor.patch. So I'm going to get version 1.2, 120.0. It'll keep prompting you to search for more packages if you want to. I'm just going to do one at a time. And so now what it's going to do is it's going to, this happened really quick, let me scroll up. It's going to update my composer.json file, which I'll show you in a moment. Then it's going to make a call to packages, get that library information, including like where the code actually lives, any dependencies it has, and it's going to download those. So you'll see it actually installed 2 packages. Monologue, the package I requested, as well as a package that Monologue depends on. Monologue depends on PSR log, so it downloaded that one. As a developer, I didn't necessarily know what other packages were dependent on the library I wanted to use, but Composer could read that information and get those dependencies for me. So that saved me a bunch of time, a bunch of head scratching about why this library wasn't working and what it was missing. So if we look at the Composer.json file, you'll see it got updated by Composer. It added that package with the version I downloaded for me. So monologue 1.20.0. It added to my require array. What we can also see in this directory now, I have the .lock file was generated and the vendor directory was created. So if I open the lock file, this has a lot of information in it. And this is, so the JSON file, it's how Composer keeps track of all the packages it's maintained for you. I like to think of it as kind of like the database or the brain for Composer. So you see it has Monologue, the package I requested, the version it downloaded, where it got that information, the commit it pulled. It also tells about the requirements Monologue has, so it has a requirement on having the PSR log package as well. You'll see down here, if I go further, it downloaded PSR log, it's keeping track of that as well. Important thing about the lock file, so you do not edit the lock file. The reason for that is generated for Composer, by Composer for Composer. If you want to monkey around in it, go for it, but you're going to screw up your project. So just leave it alone, and you'll be much happier. The other thing I want to show here is the vendor directory. If I look in the vendor directory, you're going to see there's a bunch of, don't commit your, it has a bunch of directories in it. This is where Composer keeps all the code that you don't necessarily know the structure of and you don't care about. Now I feel like I have to be very delicate with touching my laptop. Do not commit your vendor directory to your Git repository. Reason for this is the only thing you want in your Git repository is code that you control, code that you are writing, code that you know about. The vendor directory, you have no purview into it. And as soon as you commit that code to your repository, you are the one who's maintaining it, and you're not letting Composer do its job. So again, you have to put that burden back on your team doing that. Yes?
So if you're including Composer with the project,
Yep.
that means then that you're including composer.var and composer.json and composer.lock.
Yes.
But you should not include vendor?
Correct. Because vendor is completely third-party code, and you don't want to be the one who has to maintain that. You want Composer can keep control of that. There may be some services where, on your production environment, how do you get that vendor code on there? And you want a production environment that either you can run the Composer commands to download that third-party code, or you're pushing up some sort of build artifact that you're generating in a CI environment that would run Composer for you and download that vendor code.
But if people were working, with multiple copies of your project, each one of them is going to run the Composer command. And
To
get their own
to get their own copies of that third-party code, correct. Okay. I'm going to show that in just a moment. All right, you can run Composer require with a specific package name. So I'm going to do this by being a good developer and add some unit testing to my project. So I'm going to do Composer require PHP unit. PHP unit. So what this is going to do, it's not going to prompt me at all. Composer is going to go look on Packagist. It's going to find the latest version of PHP unit, and it's going to download it, as well as look at how much stuff it downloaded. This is all other libraries that PHP unit depends on. It would have been painful for me as a developer to have to install all these in the right place by myself. So instead, Packagist takes care of that for me, and it downloads version 8.0 of PHP unit. So actually 8.0.4. The third way you can run Composer require, like I said, is with a specific version. And Composer accepts many version constraints that you can specify. So you can be very exact with major.minor.patch, so like 1.0.1. You can give it any sort of range with standard operators. So you could say greater than or equal to version 1.0, but less than 2.0. So I want anything that's the latest version that's below the next significant release. You can do wildcards. So say 1.0.star, so give it the latest patch version. So that way you can keep updating to that next patch version. I'll show about updating in a little bit. You can do a shorthand of a tilde. So this tilde 1.2 is equivalent to saying greater than or equal to 1.2 but less than 2.0. It's just a little shorthand for doing it. And then if you have a package that you want to use that doesn't have a stable release, I talked about stability flags, you can pass that and say, I want version 2.0 at dev or at alpha, at beta. So for specific packages, you can tell Composer, look, I know I only want production level code, but for this one, I really want to use the dev version. And Composer's like, okay, that's what you want to do, I'll get it for you. So I recommend doing that per package. So let's take a look at that. Running the package name in a specific version. I already got PHP unit. Let's get some user testing in here. I'm going to get bhat. So I'm going to say composer require bhat/bhat bhat. And I'm going to get version 3.3.star. So this is going to tell me, this tells Composer, I want the latest patch version that's 3.3. Whatever the latest version is. So when I put this command in, Composer is going to check packages. It's going to get the information, find what version matches that pattern. It's going to download all the requirements and that version of bhat, which up the top here you can see it's bhat version 3.3.1 that downloaded. And we can also see in the composer.json file that it has that version constraint I put in there. 3.3.star. Yes.
For version constraints, as I've been working through Drupal updates, one of the things I've done is been very specific here in composer.json to make sure that when I run composer update that it doesn't take me from a major version to the next. I make that edit directly in composer.json. Is that okay, or should I be doing that in a different way, like running a composer command to change?
So the question is for the recording. Where should you make the change to your version constraints to know you don't want to give it next to a different release? You want to stick within a release,
or you're ready for it,
or you're ready for it. You want to change it. I recommend changing it in your composer.json file.
Okay.
The other way to do it is you could use composer remove to get rid of the package, and then composer require with a different version constraint. You could do that. But if you just update the version constraint in your JSON when you run composer update, or composer install, it'll find that you have a different version installed, and it'll get the next version that matches your constraint. So it's a perfect place to do it.
Thank you.
Speaking of installing packages and updating packages, like I said, you don't include your vendor directory in your repo, so how do other people on your teams, how do other environments get that third-party code? This is the composer install command. So running composer install, what it's going to do is read from your composer.lock file. The lock file, it always, no matter what version constraint you put in your .json file, lock file always stores a major.minor.patch. It always has a specific version it downloaded. So it's going to read from composer.lock, and it's going to download that specific version that was specified in the lock file, which means anytime someone on your team runs composer install and it reads from the lock file, they're going to get the same exact version that you had downloaded before. Now, there are arguments versus having your lock file in your repo versus not having it in there. If you don't have it in there, what's going to happen is composer install will read from the .json file, which if you have wildcard characters, someone may get a different version than the version you have.
Right. That was You said they were going to get the exact same thing, whereas...
Right, if you have the lock file. If you don't have the lock file, Composer will generate a new one by reading composer.json, and again, they could have a different version than you, and we don't want that. We want everyone to have the same versions. And I recommend highly that you commit the composer lock file to your repo, so your whole team, all your environments use it, and then you dedicate somebody to being in charge of being the one who updates packages and the version numbers. So you set that as a role that somebody handles. So I'm going to demo running composer install, and to do this, I'm going to do something a little silly. I'm going to delete my vendor directory. So when I do that now, right, I just have composer.json, composer lock. This is like I'm someone new on the team. I download the repo. I have composer installed locally in this, globally in this case, and so now I run composer install. And this reads from that lock file, and it downloads all the packages for me. And now if I look, I have the vendor directory again. It has all my code, all the third-party code I need. So I'm ready to go on this project. I'm all set up with that third-party code. Pretty quick and easy. So that's installing stuff. There's already been questions. What about in updating packages? This is running composer update. So what composer update will do, you can run it a couple different ways. It's going to read from the .json file for your version constraints. It's going to try to update your packages. You'll update the lock information. If it finds a new version, it's going to update all the code in the vendor directory for that version. So if I go to the different ways you can run composer update, you can just say composer update, and it's going to try to update all the libraries you have defined in your composer.json file. Or you can tell it a specific package, and it'll only update that one package. So I use that one more often than not, instead of just updating everything. So I'm going to show them backwards. I'm going to update a package first, and then I'm going to update everything. So to run composer update with a package, again, since we're on TV, I have to make a change. I'm going to change this bhat version. I'm going to say tilde 3.3. So what this is now going to tell Composer is I want anything that's below version 4 of bhat. So give me the latest version that's at least 3.3 but less than 4. So now if I run composer update, I'll say bhat. It's going to read my composer JSON file, check my version constraints thing, make a call to packages, and get any information to see what version do you have that matches this pattern, and it's going to update it. So it's updated from 3.3.1 to 3.5, because that's the latest version that matches that constraint. And then it downloads the files, and it updates my lock file, and I'm good to go. So I have the latest version of bhat. The other way to run this is, again, just running composer update without any other arguments. And again, that's going to read from composer.json and try to update all your packages. So if I run this now, actually I have to make a change to my composer.json. I'm going to change my monologue to be, I'll do tilde 1.2. I'll do caret 1.2. It's basically the same thing. So it's saying I want anything below the next significant release. So now if I just run composer update, again, it's going to read from composer.json, and it's going to see that monologue, there is a new version installed, so it's going to download the additional libraries required, and it updates to version 1.24. You see it downloaded other things. It removed a package that was no longer needed, because the newer version doesn't require it, and it updates all the other packages that it depends on that need new versions. So take cares of that for me, so I don't have to. So that's composer update. So what if you find out there is a library you no longer want to use on your package, on your project? You can remove it using composer remove. So the remove command, you can only run it one way by passing a package argument, a vendor package argument. And it's going to update your composer.json file to get rid of that. It's going to get rid of it from the lock file, and it's going to clean up your vendor directory to get rid of that code and any abandoned dependencies that it may have. So again, you can only run this by running composer remove package. If you try to run it without an argument, it's going to tell you can't do that. So let's say I no longer need in this project PHP unit. I can say composer remove PHP unit / PHP unit. So what composer does is it deletes it from my .json file. It reads from the log file what PHP unit depends on, and it checks that dependencies and all those packages to see if they're used anywhere else. If they're not dependencies of any other package I had downloaded, it's going to delete them. So it removed a whole bunch of code, because these are all packages that only were installed because PHP unit needed them. So if we look in the vendor directory, there's a lot less code in here. If we look at the composer.json file, you'll see PHP unit was removed by composer. It got rid of it because I told it I don't care about it anymore. So with that done, now what? Well, now you can do everything else. You have Composer managing all this stuff for you, all this vendor code for you. Now you can focus on building what matters, the code that differentiates your product to your client, to your company, and whatnot. But how do you use this vendor code, since you don't really have a purview into how it's structured or where it sits or where all the code lives? Composer generates an autoload file. This autoload file uses PSR4 autoloading syntax so that you can instantiate classes and objects, and the autoload file will check that and know what vendor code to include in to be run. So the simplest way to do this is you can say require from the vendor autoload.php. You'll see I go up one directory because of the security structure, and then I can just instantiate an object. So say I want to use monologue logger, I just say new monologue logger, and then the autoload file is going to know that it needs to include all the classes for monologue for me. I don't have to know anything about the structure of vendor, where monologue is actually stored. I just have to add the autoload.php file, and I can use those classes the way I want to. So with that, the recap is Composer manages project dependencies for you on PHP projects, so your team can focus on their time and budget on building the code that matters that you can control. You can install Composer per project or globally. Again, depends on what your team's preference is. Composer has three main parts, technically, 3.5 main parts. Composer.json file, which has dependency and project information. The lock file, which Composer uses to keep track of all your packages. The vendor directory that stores all the third-party code, and then the far file, that's the executable. The 5 basic commands you need to know is the init command to generate that JSON file, the require command for adding packages, install for downloading that package library, update for updating to the next version, and remove to get rid of packages. And then finally, use that third-party code by including the autoload file that Composer generates for you. And then you start using those packages, and you don't have to know about their structure. I have a couple resources for everybody here. The first link is bit.ly link, Nerd Composer. It's an annotated version of this presentation. It has screen recordings of all the commands I've demonstrated so that you can see what goes on, and I have a breakdown of what's happening behind the scenes. Getcomposer.org, the official Composer website, has a lot of great documentation, more advanced topics. And then packages.org is just a place you go there and like search for a common word, and you'll find a PHP package that does it for you. It's really cool. We have some time for questions. So if you want to give feedback on this talk or the conference, go to nerd.ngo/feedback. And yeah, that's it. Any questions? Or applause? That's always a good one.
So, go ahead.
I just, you've done Drupal stuff, so I know that Drupal does Composer a little weird compared to everyone else. Is that mostly because it downloads stuff outside of the vendor folder?
So how Drupal uses the Composer is a little more advanced. You can set up and getcomposer.org, the Composer website talks about this in more advanced topics. You can set up Composer to say when you download a package, if it has a keyword of what type of package it is, you can put it in a different directory than just vendor. And that's what Drupal does. That's what you can do with WordPress as well. Is the Drupal scaffolding project will say if you download something and it's called the Drupal library, put it in the modules directory or put a theme in the themes directory. So you can specify that. You can do that for any PHP project you're using Composer for. And that's what Drupal does. So it can make it a little confusing, but it makes it easier. So good question.
So continue with that Drupal question. So, Drupal of old, all of your stuff is in sites all, modules, etc. But with a Composer project, when you're deploying it, you've got this web subdirectory, like your web root in your presentation, which used to be all that we had to deploy to become our doc root on our server for production. But do we need all of the other bits? Like in vendor, it seems like what goes in vendor are PHP unit and things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, the question is along the lines of like Drupal projects, do you need the vendor directory? If you use Composer on Drupal, it puts everything in like modules directory or in a themes directory. It depends on what you're using. There's modules that depend now, since a lot of modules now use Composer in Drupal specifically, so that they depend on third-party libraries, so that they don't have to rewrite APIs and things like that. Those libraries that aren't Drupal specific are going to live in the vendor directory. So if you're installing modules with Composer, you don't want to include the vendor directory, but you're still going to want it up there. So if you're using a build artifact, like if you're hosting on Acquia, you have to have the vendor directory present in your repo, but you can use a build tool, a CI tool in place to generate that file for that directory for you by running Composer commands and then check it into Acquia. So you still need it for a lot of things, because a lot of Drupal modules are relying on being not lazy but efficient and using packages that already exist instead of having to write it all ourselves. So yes, you definitely still need everything. If you're not used to the Drupal 8 structure, it is structured a bit differently. You keep modules outside of the core directory, still have them in webroot. So
So you said to remove the vendor directory except don't?
right, so it depends on, so do not include the vendor directory in your Git repository. Caveat for Drupal specific things, if you're hosting on Acquia and you're only working directly in the Acquia Git repository, you need the vendor directory there. There are tools you can use to get around that. You can use the Acquia BLT tool for deploying, and it'll actually generate a separate repository in your project base and then push that repository up with the vendor directory. Or like I said, you can use something like Circle CI or Jenkins or Bitbucket pipelines, any CI tool that automates that task of you merge in code, it executes composer install, then checks in all those files and pushes up to Acquia, so it adds up. So Acquia needs the vendor directory, but you should try to figure out so that you don't have to maintain it in your repo for your local
So
department.
don't deploy using Git?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't deploy directly using Git. I would deploy using some other tool just to download those packages for you. Otherwise, if you're using just Git, then you have to log into the server and run composer install to get everything you need. So,
Pantheon's the same way.
yeah.
We host there, and I think they said that it was something about composer install being pretty intensive for the servers. Or,
Yeah.
So you couldn't actually just terminal in and
Right. So for Acquia and Pantheon, you can't just terminal in. You can't run composer install because most of the time it's shared, right? So that's where using something in place like Acquia BLT deploy or a CI tool. CI do it, yeah. Make CI do it, run in the CI environment, and then push up that artifact to the host, and that's good because then you have the barrier between your developers directly committing to that place.
So artifact, right?
Yeah.
If you do, your composer command, composer optimize autoloader, no dev locally.
Yep.
Is that not the artifact for deployment then, in terms of?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Right.
So how would you generate, what is the artifact for deployment?
The artifact for deployment it's basically everything plus the vendor directory at the very basic. So after you run composer install or those other composer commands that you need to run for your thing to work, or if you're building like a SaaS, compiling SaaS, stuff like that, that's the artifact. Everything that's the final version of the code. So that's what you want to push up to your servers, your environments. So it's best if you can automate that or set up a CI tool so you don't have to do it repeatedly yourself.
Right. Just the terms get thrown around a lot. I want to make sure my understanding is solid.
Yeah. All right, I'm out of time. So thank you for sitting here. Hopefully this recording goes well.